Welcome to Waking Up is Not Enough, Flourishing in the Human Space. Whether you awaken through meditation, spiritual practice, near-death experience, ingesting a mind-altering substance, or being born again, you still return to your messy life without any special instructions. In this podcast, Polly Young-Eisendrath and Michael Berger talk with scientists, spiritual teachers, and other experts about how awakening can connect to a new path for flourishing and development on which waking up is important, but not enough, and growing up is never finished. Polly and Mike bring different kinds of expertise to the conversation. Polly is a psychologist, Jungian analyst, mindfulness teacher, author, and longtime practitioner of Zen Buddhism, as well as the founder and director of the Center for Real Dialogue. Mike is an expert in psychedelics, an entrepreneur, a skeptic, a practitioner of Jewishness, a documentary filmmaker, and a real dialogue specialist. The Center for Real Dialogue produces and edits this podcast entirely through donations. We want to keep it available for free to our listeners. Our unique perspective needs to be supported by people like you. Please make a donation on our GoFundMe platform, introduce our podcast to family and friends, and support us on social media. We genuinely need the support of all of our entire community, and we're grateful for it.
Henry Shuman is a Zen teacher, poet, and author of Original Love, his most recent exploration of awakening and the path of heart. Henry is the founding teacher at the Original Love program and teaches on the popular meditation app Waves. Henry is also the guiding teacher at Mountain Cloud Zen Center in Sante Fe, New Mexico, and his earlier memoir, One Blade of Grass, is a powerful account of personal healing and spiritual discovery. Henry and I have a wonderful and lively conversation about original love and the undivided unity of life. So, Henry, hello. It's great to see you, hear you.
Likewise, Paul, it's lovely to see you again and to be having a chance to chat with you. It's always fascinating and deeply helpful for me when we do.
Well, and Henry, I would never call it a chat, except you do with your English background. I feel it's always a deep dive, even if you and I say hello to each other. There's something in it that goes beyond hello. So
I totally agree. I feel it too. Yeah.
So I'm really happy that we can talk today about really your new book, Original Love. And of course, I have been a part of that movement for a while. And we'll get back to the book in a moment. But I wanted to ask you, as we always do on this podcast, and I need to note that Mike Berger is not here with me today. I know that Mike is doing fine, but he had the sort of difficult luck of being in the path of a tornado in St. Louis, and his roof came down on Saturday, I think it was. But and so this is Monday. So Mike won't be here today because I think along with about 250,000 people, he's without power.
Well, I'm so sorry to hear it. That sounds like a pretty fearsome experience. Wow.
Yes. I think a big kind of event in nature. And so it's just you and I, Henry. And, in some ways that means that you won't get questioned by Mike, who has a background in psychedelics and often asks really good questions that I would never think of. But the questions that I think of will be the ones we're stuck with. So, I'd like to start with the issue of awakening, how you describe or define it. And of course, it's in all of your books, or at least your memoir books, but then also your own experiences and how you, let's say, would describe those or convey them.
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, the word awakening can have a whole range of meanings, and they're all valid. I tend to use it in a rather specific way, which is, I think, close to, what Buddhism usually is pointing to. And, the root Bud is to do with awakening and so on. And but I must really acknowledge that you can use it in tons of different ways, But when it comes to the meditation world as I've known it, and that's Zen, and that's other kinds of Buddhism, and a little bit of Advaita and other things. It means something rather specific, which is seeing that the ordinary sense of self that we have taken to be at the root of and the heart of who we are is only an assumption. It's only actually a set of thoughts, and it can be seen that it isn't the fixed entity that I've taken myself to be. It's very important to say this isn't to deny that there is something that we are, and there's something that we're each specifically. We do have a sort of personality, each of us, and it's something to be cherished, I think, in many ways, although obviously we can work on it too. But to this experience of awakening is being somehow totally liberated from that. And it is a kind of liberation because it brings us into this sense that we're part of a greater wholeness that is not some sort of integration. It's not some kind of feeling more like we're connected. It's actually discovery that we're something quite different. There's a level, there's an order of experience that's just a total shift where everything is somehow one thing. And the most common experience of awakening of this ilk, of this kind of use of the word, is a profound sort of experience. Really, it's a dramatic shift where we just find we're not separate and there is no separation anywhere. And it's a huge thing to experience because it overturns everything we've taken as the most significant assumptions about the way life is, which is that, I'm a person navigating this world that I'm separate from, and it's to see very radically right through that there's actually another totally different way of experiencing things. And so it's very shocking, really, if it sort of should be shocking because it is really shocking, and because it so upends all the assumptions that cluster around the basic assumption that I am this separate entity navigating this world that is, difficult and beautiful and troubled and marvelous and, and gives me lots of things I want and gives me lots of things I don't want, And so this sort of entirety of the experience of life is seen in a thoroughly different light. That's the kind of awakening. That's the kind of use. That's the kind of experience that, I use the word to be pointing to, and that I do acknowledge that it's a rather specific use of the word.
I wanted to ask you just a clarification question now that I have this wonderful Zen master here. I get to ask this question. By background, and I'll get back to your own experiences, I won't forget it. But by background, I'm a developmental psychologist. And so I spent quite a lot of time studying the work of Michael Lewis, and I've interviewed Michael Lewis. He spent 65 years researching emotional development in children at Rutgers University, and his specialty is the self-conscious emotions. And they don't come on board for humans until 18 to 24 months. So we have roughly a year and a half of having no self. In a sense, we don't remember it because after about 4 years old, we have amnesia for everything that happened previously. And that's why children who remember their past lives tend to remember those past lives between 3 and 4. And then they have amnesia for them almost entirely after 6 or 7. And so there is this issue, of I'm a Zen practitioner also. Everybody who listens to this knows that. What Buddhists claim about Buddha nature is kind of, I would say, self-evident in developmental psychology, that all of us have experienced, whether we have, one kind of personality or not. We've had the experience of non-dual awareness, but we've forgotten it. And so I always wonder what the Buddhists say about that. So here I have you. What would you say about the fact that developmentally, the human infant has this long, very dependent period starting in the womb, where apparently there is profound compassion because the babies, like if there are multiple babies in the womb, they comfort each other. And the baby does comfort the mother as soon as it sees the mother, tries to keep the mother kind of in a more or less stable framework, happy framework, because baby needs mommy, and so I need you to be happy in order to help me be happy. So I wonder if there is ever an acknowledgement that this happened previously for everybody, but they'd forgotten it, or if that seems irrelevant to you.
That's a great question. I mean, I would say there's always a feeling of a return with it. Like I have known this before. I would say it must be very different to experience it as somebody who has already developed self-consciousness. To
Yeah.
be, I think it's the learning there is vastly different because you're bringing it to bear then on a consciousness that is aware of itself. So it's very, very different. But I think I don't know that I would say it must come from experience, in infancy and in the womb. I just don't know. But for sure, many people report this sense of it having a familiarity, a deep familiarity. Oh my gosh, this is something I have known, and now I know it again. And also in the Mahayana Buddhism generally, it's maybe a little different in Theravada Buddhism, but for sure in Mahayana Buddhism, there's a very strong sense that this is everywhere already. We're
Yes.
not. It's always been this way. It's not that you've made something new happen. You've just recognized it anew, and that's the change. And it's a huge change to recognize it again. And
Yes.
I like that idea. I mean, I've read in places that Freud was perhaps a bit dismissive of those kinds of experiences, calling them a return to oceanic infantilism or something. I think he's totally wrong about that, personally. But because I think it can be, the most important thing we experience in life. It can change everything in massively positive ways because we find we're so much less alone than we think we are, and it also changes the nature of what it is to be alone. It doesn't deny our particularity somehow. It reaffirms it in a whole different way. So I don't know. I found it the journey of my lifetime is having somehow stumbled into that unprovoked as a youth in a very powerful way. I mean, for me, overwhelmingly powerful way and positive way. It then became rather problematic because I kind of lost it and didn't know how I found it or lost it because
Right. Well,
it seemed.
maybe we can talk about that right now. And I don't think that sense that because you happened onto it without any other context, that when that happens to people, I believe, I mean, I had some experiences, not like yours, but let's say contradictory to what would be ordinary reality. But I thought I had made them happen somehow when I was a child. I thought it was by doing this or doing that. So I didn't, I didn't have the impression that this was the case already. I had the impression I'd done something. And I think that happens when it happens innocently, whether people take a substance or whether they have a car accident or, there can be the feeling like, or the sense of, what is that? Can I make it happen again? How did it happen? So could you tell us your first awakening experience and then how that began your, let's say, development from that perspective forward? Because you are inherently a writer, I think, by identity and by occupation. And that's where you have taken this to also is into writing.
Yeah, true. Okay, so I'll try to be really succinct. And I'll talk about the first time and then a later time that was really important. The first time was I was 19 years old. I'd written my first book actually. I'd been working far away from home and then backpacking, and I was alone on a beach one afternoon, staring at the sun going down. Well, not directly at the sun, but rather at the light on the water. And it just suddenly struck me that I thought I knew what sunlight on water was, that it was just dazzlingly bright. But as I looked at it more closely, I could see that it wasn't only that. It was partly extremely bright sort of scales of light on the water. But where there wasn't light, it was utterly black. And it just suddenly hit me as strange, like it's both really bright and incredibly dark. And that was interesting in and of itself. But then I just reflected, well, water's clear, it's transparent. Air is clear and transparent. Light, you don't see, it just bounces off things. What's actually happening when I see this surface? And I don't know how or why, but all of a sudden it all just changed. And I wasn't a person looking at something. I was part of the whole. There was just one thing, and I was part of that. And it was both what I was seeing and it was the seeing of it. And my ordinary sense of self had just gone. And then it seemed as if there was really nothing visible and tangible. There was just one kind of substance less fabric almost that everything was made of. And it was, it was totally insubstantial. totally insubstantial, and it made all distance disappear. Everything was immediately close. The furthest reaches of the universe somehow were just right here, and all time was right here. The earliest beginnings of time and the end of time is all right here, and it was very vivid, and clear, and 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 then I sort of, in a sense, came back, to being more like a human being standing on a beach and recognizing that that was going on, and that this extraordinary sort of, well, it was like an epiphany, a real epiphany to the sort of the nature of experience had just happened, and it left me with an incredible sense of love. I felt like I totally belonged. Belonging had actually been a bit of an issue for me for various reasons in my somewhat traumatized childhood. But suddenly, belonging was so thorough and so complete that it wasn't an issue at all, because I was made of what the whole universe was made of. Is what it felt like I'd just seen. And the thing about it is, as a pretty rational, I'd say, I guess I could dare say, kind of well-educated person. I mean, I come from this extremely rational, logical, positivist, empiricist background at Oxford University. Both my parents were professors there, and I'd had a thorough grounding in what they used to call liberal humanism, sort of rational enlightenment style education, and with learning languages from a young age and all the rest of it. But none of that had given me an inkling of this kind of a view on reality, not at all. And yet I knew that what I'd just seen was more real than anything I'd been taught, and it was somehow a truth. It was just overpoweringly clear that I'd just seen something about the very nature of my own life, and what this world, this life was living in was. It was really undeniable on a personal experiential level. So, years go by. I kind of, it faded, and over the weeks, and then I had a really difficult re-entry into my home when I went back home, back into depression and anxiety, and the skin disease I'd had all my early childhood came back, and that was a bitter, disappointing experience to have it come back. But gradually I got better, and and that was in part by picking up meditation at the age of 24. That was a critical thing. Getting into therapy of various kinds over the years, and then in time getting into Zen training, which I did because I understood that Zen knew about that kind of experience and was interested in it. And actually, it through the Zen training I went. I mean, it took a long time, but I had several more experiences that weren't the same as that. They were all different, but they kind of came from the same world, as it were. They came from the same level of reality. Then finally, something happened in a Zen retreat when I was deep in training, where really everything just totally dropped away. Really, it was a thorough. It still baffles me, and it's hard to talk about. But there was just nothing. But instead of that being a problem, it was marvelous. And it was the way I thought about it since then is that it was like seeing that just really truly at the bottom, it really is all empty, like the Buddhists say. But actually that emptiness is infinitely generative, creative, and generous. And it's sort of giving everything. It's giving this very moment. And since that moment, which I can pinpoint exactly, it was 17 years ago now and 3 months, but since that moment, it's like that moment's always still here. It's like, I mean, I have to remember it. I can't forget about it, but anytime I remember it, it's here. And I feel this incredible sense of gratitude that anything's arising at all.
And that's remembering is close to the word that supposedly the Buddha used for what we now say is mindfulness, which is sati. And so that recollection that there is another way to be, or another way to be in things, that comes, I think, from practice and having the experiences through practice rather than just having them happen. Although, again, I'm not totally convinced of anything I say about this because I've talked to so many people. But I think that practice, like many people happen into something. Not everyone happens in as completely as you did initially, Although I've spoken to, and I just spoke the other day to someone who came here just to talk to me about the experience that he had of everything becoming just kind of very, very thin and then falling away completely, and then being completely at one with what he said, seemed like God. Like he felt the love and he could feel the unity, and it lasted for quite a while. He didn't have any background in meditation. And when he went then to a Buddhist meditation center, he was questioned in a way that kind of threw him off and
Mhm, mhm.
bothered him a bit, because
Yeah,
I think there probably wasn't quite immediately enough warmth in the engagement with
yeah.
him. In any case, I don't know for sure if he's going to actually practice meditation. I can't tell, but I do know this, that the practice does do something for one, that that I think is worthwhile at least. And I don't personally can't see how anything else substitutes for it. And I wonder if that has been your experience too, that by practicing with a teacher with whom eventually I assume, I know that you had a close relationship, and a person who got to know you and knew your personality, etc., could ask you questions, could kind of give you a bit of a compass, and that did something that made that initial experience different, a little different. Could maybe say something about that.
Yeah, thank you. I had the good fortune eventually to find a teacher who just recognized what I was saying. And actually I did tell him about that experience and one other that happened a decade later. And I'd never actually I'd been to many teachers before, but not one of them had sort of directly recognized what I was talking about. And it was really nice to have somebody recognize it. It really made a difference. So I feel for your friend who went through that, that your whoever it was that you met who was
Mhm.
describing that, because I think it's a danger with all these different traditions that they can get a little bit set in their ways, and they have specific ways that it must be described or something, and they've got some kind of scheme of how meditation is supposed to develop, and I think we humans can defy all of that. Nobody knows the rules, really. There aren't any rules. And I got lucky in having a particular teacher who was just very open-minded, even though he was in a particular kind of Buddhist tradition, a particular kind of Zen Buddhist tradition. There'll be other teachers in that same style that I might not have connected with. I think it's a fortunate thing if you find a teacher you can really connect with. But I also think the traditions can make a bit too much of themselves, because we're talking about real stuff where they don't have a monopoly on it, any of them. And I always think that the best that a teacher can be is some kind of midwife that's helping us find more about what we are, and not it's not that they're giving us, the teacher and the tradition aren't really giving us something. They're helping us find what is already here. I would see it that
Yes.
way.
Well, I've had a couple of teachers who've instructed me deeply. One is Philip Kapleau, who's in more or less the same lineage that you're in, and the other one is Shinzen Young, who was in a number of different approaches and practices. And then finally, in the POA practice, Ayang Rinpoche and Anyan Rinpoche. All of those teachers, I would say, approached me more from maybe I mean I don't use this very often as a word, but like a heart-oriented perspective, rather than instructing specifically a certain way of practicing, because I could do practices from the beginning of doing them, and yet I didn't know what they represented, and I was dubious. I felt dubious about some of what was going on, particularly in the Zen environment I was in initially, with a lot of shouting going on and a lot of using of this paddle. And I was young, and I stayed with it simply because I liked Philip Kapleau. That was really the reason I stayed. I mean, the rest of it seemed crazy and a little cult-like. There was, I could sense in him something I trusted, but it was more like he saw into me. And then by the time I met Ayang Rinpoche, when he just saw me, he said a bunch of things right away without even asking me anything. And
Right.
so, that kind of meeting is unusual. I've met many, many, many teachers, but I didn't have that connection. I know, Henry, that I have that connection with you, but I knew that from I don't know. I think I've met you in person only once, and when we were actually in the regular world together, I could feel it. So, I mean, I think there is something that's quite personal in this, but then there's something that's quite universal, and it's a little hard to put the two together. And I try to encourage people to move along any path they want to take, whether it's a religious path or I don't know if there's really a path with psychedelics. I mean, Mike would say there is, but I don't see it as having the, I don't know, that sense of instruction, but to move along with a teacher who sort of gets them, because there is a way, and this is where I want to get to your book, the current book called Original Love, because I think that the word love is apt, and yet it's a difficult word to use. I mean, even I prefer it over emptiness, for example, because in English, emptiness has a kind of bleakness in it, no matter what you do to decorate it. You know, you can call
Yes.
it interdependence, or you can call it whatever you want to call it, context. Sometimes I call it context, but it's not a great word in English. Love is better, but it's got its problems too. So, I wanted to ask you about the title Original Love, and both on the idea of origin
Yeah.
and on that idea of love, because perhaps there's a lot in those two words that are, that would be important just to get the framework.
Yeah, thank you, Polly. That's great. Yeah, I mean, I want to just echo that I feel the same, this beautiful sense of connection. I'm actually just feeling a whole lot of gratitude and kind of excitement being able to just chat with you. I mean, chat is probably not quite the right word for this deep kind of conversation, but it feels like it, very free and deep and connected. And that's a lovely thing to know in this life. I'm so happy you asked that, because to me, it is a very real and serious and lovely matter, this original love. What I mean by it is almost what I was talking about with that experience when everything disappeared, really, truly was gone. But out of that came this sort of abiding gratitude. And there is a great sense of peace and of love. And the way I sort of put it together is that it's from that, you rightly say emptiness is such a terrible word, but if we can just use it for the moment as a cipher, it's from that utter emptiness, absolute emptiness or goneness, that everything is given. And that process of giving is love. I mean, so it's not love. Granted, it's not love in all our ordinary senses of the word, probably, because it's quite a fierce creative energy. Really, it's like a fire. I think sometimes I think of it an image that's a little apt. I mean, none of this should be taken too seriously, but when you look at a waterfall and you see there's this constant motion and yet it's staying still, the actual falls aren't moving, they're still right where they are, but there's this constant flow. It's a bit like that. It's something that's, it's insubstantial and yet so full of energy, this active, real, creative, active energy. And yet it's also somehow insubstantial, both. It is love that's creating everything in my humble opinion, but it's a very sort of fierce, empty, marvelous love at the same time. And so that's why it's original, and that's why it's love. But at the same time, the phrase is a riff also on that. There's a famous Zen question: have you seen your original face? Which is another sort of cipher, really, for just, have you discovered what has always been here? This original
Yes.
face you had, they say, since even your parents were born. Yeah.
So that question, that was a koan that was in the tradition that I practiced in with Kapleau. That have you seen your original face was one reason why, or what is your original face? That I stopped practicing koans. I asked to be let go of that because I could see people competing on the koan. I could hear it even around me, and I was a really excellent student on everything I ever tried. And I certainly didn't want to be competing with other people on koans. So I asked him, this was, when I was quite young when I went there, when I was 21, and maybe when I was about 22 or 23, I said, could I just stop doing this? I mean, I really don't want to do this in this way that I'm doing it. I can tell it's not right. And he didn't Kepler didn't know me very well, but for some reason he took seriously that question, and he said, "No, you can do this other thing called shikantaza," but he said, "I'll tell you that it's just much harder, and good luck with it because I'm not going to give you any instructions really." Because he said, "I'll tell you what it means. It sort of means sitting like a rock, and just you're going to sit, and you're just going to sit, and you're going to notice. You're going to kind of grope around to see what's happening, and in fact." That's what I did, and it was confusing, and it didn't have enough, but the other thing had too much.
Yeah.
And so, the questioning, like, original bothered me. Like, what do you mean original? Like, if it do you mean in the womb original, or do you mean, the original karmic face, or what do you mean? And
Mm.
so I do know that the terms are difficult, but somehow putting original and love together, I liked when you did it. But you're somebody that I like, and so it's like I like it then. I think you teach it. I'd like you to talk about, you have an app, and this is surprising to me that you have an app, but I know you have an app, and I would like to know, why you did that and what you do with your app, but then also your program for Original Love. I've sent really quite a few people from therapy in there. I'm not never sure if they identify themselves, but everybody loves you. I can tell you that you evoke a lot of affection and warmth, and I understand it. But that's a good thing. I'm not saying that to in any way make you self-conscious or anything. I mean, I think it actually is very helpful because often the people that are seeking this path are people that have already felt alienated.
Right.
They've already felt left out, or they're in pain, like real physical pain, that kind of pain, or they've lost their relationships. And so, the fact that you do evoke a lot of warmth and you're there in a warm way is very important to them. It's very, of all the people I've sent at least.
Well, thank you for sending people. That's great. And I mean, I agree. I think anything that encourages people on the path is good. And if a sense of warmth does that, then I think it's good. But Polly, what you were saying about your time with Caplo Roshi just then is exactly why I made this program, Original Love, that I think there's a whole middle ground that is really easy to overlook. And, there's some worlds of practice, particularly modern mindfulness, that's really just sort of the beginnings and the foundations of practice in mindfulness. And it's great that that's there, but it doesn't let people know that they're totally not being exposed to a whole other realm of practice. On the other hand, on the other end, you've got practices like that style of Zen, with Kapla came out of it as well. It's Sanbo Zen was the organization in Japan that I'm part of as well. It really emphasizes this awakening side of practice. And
Right.
you're absolutely right that there's so much in between. And that's what I've done with this idea I've got about these 4 kind of zones or inns of practice, 4 areas that we can develop in. And I feel actually that any one of them can sort of be sufficient. If somebody really just rocks on mindfulness, well, you can go pretty far in it. And if somebody's more into that sort of deep connective interconnectivity kind of thing, and you can go deep into that. And if somebody's really enjoying flow states and absorption states, and you can go very far in that. And I do think that none of those is quite the same as this awakening to non-self as a thoroughly positive thing that doesn't actually deny yourself. You're
Mm.
seeing a different side of what all of your life has been. And that's why it's an original face in a nutshell, because it's always
Yeah.
been here and it's you utterly, and
Mm.
it's sort of, I don't know. I think sometimes I've heard I can't remember who it was. Maybe some psychologist talked about the ultimate subject, or maybe it was an Advaita teacher. You're
Oh,
finding,
there's Piaget's idea of the epistemic subject is exactly that. I mean, it's the subject of all subjects. And in many ways, what Piaget wrote about it is very close to what the Buddha said about his own awakening, that the Buddha deconstructed his deconstruction. Like he already knew how to deconstruct the moment to moment reality, but then he deconstructed what he was doing. He
yes,
deconstructed his own deconstruction. And I think that's what Piaget happened upon.
Oh,
And
that's
and it was
fantastic.
like an insight for him, but he never was able to he wrote an essay on it, and which I can't locate. I've tried to locate it online. I'm sure somebody will locate it, but it's rather abstract, but it's exactly what the Buddha experienced from what, reading also the Buddha's I read it, of course, in English, The Wings to Awakening, Thanissaro Bhikkhu's account, The Buddha's Awakening. I mean, it's from the discourses. But, yes, it's that taking things down or taking things, let's say, from a human perspective, we have to do this. I mean, the dog doesn't do this,
Right, right.
at all. I
Yeah.
mean, the dog is already right there, and no problems, but
Right.
the dog can't change her mind. She
No.
can't do anything with this mind. She
Right.
just is happening onto things. But, my dog is enjoying everything, and she even seems to enjoy her painful arthritis in her legs now. I mean, she'll still run and seem quite happy. And so I see that Buddha nature in her,
Yeah.
but it's much harder in the people that
Yes.
are angry or discontent with a really good life. So,
Right,
but
right,
yeah,
right.
yeah, that
That's beautiful. I mean, I too would absolutely love to know that piece of Piaget. I had no idea. I only knew about his, the childhood stages of whatever of learning and development a little bit from some social psychology I once studied.
well, the thing that I want to come back to when you're saying that there are these between practices that are not illustrated often in the ordinary things that people happen upon, or also the warmth piece of it. I want to go through your four ins, and you've just now said you could stop at any one and stay there. And I know, as far as I know, the Buddha said the same thing, particularly about the breath, working on the breath. The breath can be the whole thing. The idea that you're presenting this in an app, or I'm not sure, I haven't really honestly looked at your app. I just know it's there. And then I know you have a program that I think you teach mostly or maybe exclusively online now. I would like you to talk a little bit about those things, about why, the inns where people can stop or they can visit, and then also the app where I guess people subscribe, and then online, and why you are doing all of this.
Yeah, yeah. 5 years ago, I would not have dreamt of doing any of the above. But COVID happened, and suddenly I had to teach online. And actually, it so happens that at the same time, right around the beginning of COVID, I had a concussion falling off my bike that affected my capacity to do one-to-one teaching. You know, the Zen style of many brief encounters between teacher and student, one-to-one, I couldn't do it anymore. And once I couldn't do it, and once I had to teach online, I thought through, well, what have I been teaching? And what have I been learning from all these thousands of interviews, brief interviews that I've had with students already over the 10 or 12 years I'd been teaching at that point? And I realized that for me, there really were kind of four main areas of spiritual development that I could see. And I don't claim this is some sort of perfect way of looking at it, but I think it's an approximate way that will catch most things that people are struggling with or hoping for in a spiritual practice. And so I actually started sort of systematizing a little bit. We did a retreat online where each day we did one of these four zones. And then we went to having a whole 4-day retreat on one zone, and then another whole 4-day retreat on another zone, and another zone, another zone. So four retreats sort of a month apart on each zone, all offered on Zoom. And it seemed to sort of really help people. And it was a way somehow of getting past not being able to do one-to-one. Instead, I could sort of, hey, look, these are four main areas we can be cognizant of and we can be working on. And possibly if we're only working on one, we might be missing something. Whichever of the ones it is, it might be a more wholesome, balanced, integrated practice if we do open up another one at least. And if we've got all four humming to some extent, then we're going to have a pretty integrated, solid, balanced, healthy practice that's less liable to fall into spiritual bypassing or into grandiosity or any of the hazards that a spiritual practice can take us into, you know. So it was kind of a corrective, really, and a necessity. And once I found that it could be so effective online, which it seemed that it could be, and I could let go of that real hands-on, you know, close association with the student that I wasn't entirely sure was always healthy anyway,
Hmm.
you know.
Tell,
Um,
tell me tell me about that, because I guess I would, from my experience, because I like meeting with people in person, and because I have liked in-person meetings, when I see you online, I see you and I hear you. I don't smell you, and I don't really feel you in the way I would if we were in the room. I know you enough to be able to kind of imagine that I am feeling you,
yeah.
but that sense of a machine separating us, I do experience that as a kind of separation. But I'm open to other things because I see other things happening, and I always want to be convinced that it's possible to do this in some other way, because maybe someday I won't be meeting with people in person either. I don't know, but so tell me why you feel convinced. It seems that it can be either good enough or a substitute for in person.
Yeah, well, I would say that now I wouldn't say that it's a substitute for it. I
Hmm.
think it's a both and, you know, that I think there's a lot of people who just can't make a journey to Santa Fe, New Mexico, even if they wanted to study with me. They couldn't take the time out, they couldn't afford it. And so right there, that was a great advantage of the COVID situation, that it just became much cheaper and much more accessible. And many, many more people were coming into these gatherings that we were having online. And then a student who was in tech said, you should make an app. And I thought, well, no, surely not. And, but then actually, I started when I was talking actually with various people about it, including my nephew, who had just started meditating after 10 years in the corporate sector. A very, very, very bright and kind of effective guy. He'd been very successful, and he was just very good at making things happen. And he'd suddenly got into meditation as a result of, well, having never been at all interested in it. And he got wind of this idea of an app floating around, and decided he wanted to, if we decided to do it, he wanted to be involved and would be the CEO. And actually, I just became fairly sure that it could help many more people get on a path of meditation that would be helpful for them. And it doesn't mean that they wouldn't ever want to do something in person. And it doesn't mean that they wouldn't ever want to have a back and forth interactive one-on-one relationship with a teacher. But it would be something to get the millions of people who want to meditate, who've tried it, who are on and off with practice, and it could get them started. And people who are using it now, it's a much larger number of people than I've ever, had any kind of engagement with before. They're reporting really good things with it, that it's really helping them be consistent with practice. It's helping them, explore different sides of practice. They're getting grounded in it in a new way. And yeah, some say, but hey, I really want to do an in-person retreat, so they can go off and find one and do it. And
But
or
not with
some
Henry. But not with Henry.
Well, I'm doing a little bit of that, but the numbers are too great really
Mhm.
for that. But I'm starting to do in person again, because basically my neurology is recovered enough that I can do it now.
But that's good
Um,
to know, because I might come see you in person, actually. So I think you've been kind of regular on Sam Harris's Waking Up podcast. I seem to remember that at some point.
yeah,
And then I've also worked with quite a few students who use.
yeah,
I looked into Headspace to see what it was, because I had met a lot of college students and so on that used it. I was very disappointed when I actually looked at Headspace. I think Sam, at least in his earliest version of his podcast and so on, he did it seem like a good job of reaching people and actually engaging with their inquiry. The question that I would have, and it goes to the issue of support, which is an interesting word that you used as one of the ends. So the mindfulness, support, absorption, and awakening. I have this is a sort of question about. It's another kind of question. I want to put this question, another question around this, because it's in the questions I wanted to ask. So, you talk about sort of two channels or two ruts on this path that you're describing, or this journey. One of them is the mindfulness side, which, I would say is like concentration, equanimity combined, a certain cultivation of awareness. It's really
Yeah.
awareness training kind of thing. And the other side is the awakening side, which, I think you've described very well, this sort of falling away of this subject object dualism, or, it's the dropping off of what you assume you are, or whatever. Now, you say those are sort of the two paths that create this kind of balance, or let's say consistency of practice. And I want to talk about those two sides. But then there are also within Buddhism, and this is something I've been very, let's say, engaged in and inquiring about for a long time, these two discourses. And the
Mhm.
one discourse is karma. And it's about our intentional actions and what they actually produce, as well as the constraints on our conditions, including the people that we meet and the causes and conditions that surround us. From a Buddhist perspective, we're generating, we're engaged in conditions from the
Mhm.
moment that we come into life as a human being, or as a rat or whatever else. But we're
Mhm.
engaged in these conditions, but we're also generating those conditions through our intentional or habitual actions. And
Yes.
so that discourse is really quite different from the discourse on emptiness in Buddhism. And to some extent, they're always a bit in tension with each other, because it's kind of like the tension between, I would say, in a general way, I'm not an expert on this, but I read a lot of Buddhist history. I'm reading Donald Lopez's book now, which is incredible in the history of Buddhism. But
Yeah.
it's sort of the tension between India and China, if you want to say it that way, or you could say between the sort of rational empirical world and the
Mhm.
world of complete non-rational empirical mystery that arises, et cetera, And so, in a certain sense, those are the two, let's say, sides that
Mhm.
I feel, for me, the inquiry that I've been making. But then you raise two different issues to create a balance, the mindfulness and the awakening. Now, I want you
Mhm.
to come back to your issues, and then I want us to go into the other issues in terms of your four ends also. Because the support one, to me, struck me as karma.
Yeah.
But also, if I'm going to do my karma online, I don't know. I don't know if it's really, I can't tell whether it's really interactive with me or not.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So anyway, so let's go
Well,
back to the two ruts anyway. Yeah.
okay, okay. That metaphor actually, it comes from an early Chinese Buddhist document. This idea that practice is like a cart track, and it has two wheel ruts or wheel tracks, one for either wheel, either side, and one of those is mindfulness, and the other one is awakening or realization. But I agree with you. I mean, what I've done. Let me just before going into I love what you're saying, by the way. I totally agree, and I think that we're born into these conditions. We're always sort of inheriting conditions moment by moment and generating conditions. It's beautifully put, Polly. This also harks back to Bodhidharma, the early Indian slash Chinese, practitioner. He said there's two entrances. One entrance is all about being patient with the karma that you're inheriting, and also being don't take it to your own credit when good things happen. That's just part of what you're inheriting as well, and it's part of what you may be unconsciously generating. So he said there's one path of practice that's all about that, working with your karma, and there's another side of practice that is the sudden realization that all things are Buddha nature. All things are Buddha nature, and realizing that not just as an idea but experientially, that, oh my gosh, we all things are one thing. We all share a common nature, and but I believe that we've got to kind of do both. I don't think this is about leaving behind the karmic conditions. I think the awakening gives us a very different perspective on them, but we sort of mustn't leave them behind. I think it's actually it's yeah, the old idea of awakening as escape, that you can see in very early Buddhism that will get off this mortal coil and won't have to
Well,
come back.
let me just say that I think that has come back. I mean, I don't think it's an old idea. This is where I kind of wanted us to go here. I'm surprised it's coming now, but
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
so I would say that on this podcast, and even one reason for doing the podcast, I have to say, I've been working on, the Center for Real Dialogue, which is about healthy conflict. And I'm really quite interested in people being able to learn from their differences. I mean, all differences, political, religious, whatever it is, our
Yeah.
particularity, that we could learn from it rather than go to war over it,
Oh
has
my
been
gosh.
something that I've been with since I was a tiny child. That was really my karma, was around that. So I've been working on this real dialogue stuff, and I work hard, I do trainings and so on. And I was holding one of my trainings at the Trapp Family Lodge in Stowe, Vermont. And then there was the Vermont Association for Psychedelic something or other meeting at the largest of the hotels in Vermont, at the Spruce Mountain Hotel. And so they were having like over 500 people, and could barely get 20 people. It's over here are these people that are interested in psychedelics, and over here is this person who's trying to do something about awakening, just in terms of relationships and so on.
Right.
So I said, well, hey, wait a minute. This is bad marketing. I need to join in this other group that's doing this psychedelic renaissance, because this renaissance is a desire for awakening.
Mm,
But
mm.
then, and I can see that it really is. It really is. And there are lots and lots of people. However, it's really the desire for escape.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
and that's really what people are after, but they don't know it.
Right.
But,
Right. Right.
but they're sort of like candidates for awakening, because they have this many people have some pretty profound experiences of things dropping away,
Yeah.
but then they believe it's because they've taken this substance.
It makes a big difference if you know you've had a compound in your bloodstream. I mean, I've done a
Yeah,
little bit in my life, all of it
yeah,
post my first awakening experience,
right, right.
and I found it have a whole lot of noise and
Yeah,
sometimes a bit of signal.
yeah,
And
yeah,
and when people report it to me, I often see people who've used psychedelics, and usually, yeah, there's just so much noise, but some people do get clear signal. They'll get a true, you know,
yeah,
but they'll call it ego dissolution
right,
as if it's dissolved forever.
right.
And it totally hasn't dissolved forever.
No,
They think they've now I've seen that, I'm done. And
yeah,
that's so different from the kind of practice that you and I know, where, yeah,
yes,
you may get flashes, you may get glimpses, and I'm a walking example of this. You may get even deeper experiences, but unless you're practicing day
yeah.
by day and moment by moment the best you can, which will be always, in my case, very imperfectly, but aspiring to, you haven't got a hope in hell of actually bringing it into the way you live. And
Exactly, exactly. And yet here are all these people kind of ripe for this other thing,
well,
but
I
they
know.
but they often don't know it. But I do think that this psychedelic renaissance is like the Chinese kind of desire to cut through, but that was within the framework of practice. And so bringing these two together, I think is a how do I want to say it? It's a curious and interesting sort of circus. It's not well known, or I think in some ways the idea of awakening and the experiences that people have across these different kinds of events, from near death experience to psychedelics to absorption states to just the dropping away that's naturally for some people happens. All of those, I think, open a door,
Mm,
but if that door doesn't in some way intersect with the right kind of support,
mhm,
here it comes back to support, which is something like introduced to a practice that this is not about you, and it's not about some substance. It's not about the event that
yeah,
brought you through the door, but it's really about your life and the way you live it. And
yeah,
and it's a little hard to pull all of that together. I don't know if I see it in your book, but the people that are going to read the book are probably already involved in some practice, rather than, say, psychedelics or even near death experience, which now, does have a kind of movement in it. People are meeting and so on. But I think that the support piece of it is a big issue. And by support, I think you mean Sangha or the community.
Sangha, community, and guidance, and friendships, and actually, I think framing as well is part of it. So that we've got, and that's one of the reasons I'm doing both the app and this book, is just it's a little bit, dare I say, educational, to let people know, hey, look, there are these different territories, and they can all intersect in a beautiful way. But the biggest overarching framing is that awakening is sort of, it can seem like a goal, um, which is what we've just been talking about. It can seem like a goal somewhere I want to get to, but actually, it's much better seen as a sort of starting point.
Yes,
That it's actually
yes,
we
yes,
don't get to it, we live from it.
yes,
And
yes,
but it may take time for that switch to happen, and that's okay. And I mean, I love the Zen ox herding pictures. They're just a
yes,
perfect map of this. And I think it's an instructive thing that, the fourth ox herding picture, there's not time to go into them in detail here, but that's supposed to be like a really deep experience where everything's fallen away, and it's deep enough that you can stay connected to it henceforth. That's
yes.
really the point of it, that now you've got it, really, or it's got you, and you don't have to lose it again.
It's more
But
like it's got you, I think,
yeah,
than
I
you've
think it
got
is more
it,
like that. Yeah, you
and
let
yeah,
it you let it have you,
yeah,
and
yeah,
but that's only the fourth of 10
right.
stages, and the last four stages you've completely forgotten about awakening,
Yeah, yeah,
and it
yeah.
winds up with leading a normal life back in the marketplace, but with more generosity.
But,
And
when we were talking, Mike and I talked to Galen Ferguson on his, book on the, welcoming, and it
oh
was
yes, 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 I
yes,
love
and
that
it's on
book.
the ox herding pictures,
That's
right?
right. Yeah.
And so together we talked about the fact that it's only in the last picture that there are 2 people.
Yeah,
And really, that's kind of a problem for the Zen path in a way,
yeah,
because, the path has a lot of engagement with the world, but often not with the other human, with the human who is sitting there in the eye to eye with you, whether it's your child or your
mm,
partner or your sibling. And right now in America, there's so much estrangement, there's so much alienation in families, and people justify it based sometimes on their awakening. That
mm,
they're more awake than the other people in their family, that they've had these insights and nobody else is interested in the insights. And there's so much kind of disjuncture around this sense that somehow the awakening is kind of meaningless if you can't look someone else in the eye and sort of hold it there for a while, even if they're talking about a political party you don't
yeah,
believe in, you
yeah.
know?
Yeah,
And
but partly, surely, I mean, I'd say there's many, many more, oh, there's far more important, I would say, factors that are creating this disjunction and this oppositional thing and this inability to sit in the middle and hold two things to be true at the same time.
of
And,
course it is.
and
Right. But I
awakening
mean,
should be one of the things that's mitigating that
it
somewhat.
should be. But this is again where, I feel like there's, um, of course, again, I'm talking to a wider range of people that are not doing the meditative path. The thing that I feel is important about like your outreach is to a large group of people, and you want to reach out rather than having the one to one. I mean, the typical Zen a relationship was the one to one. The teacher and the student actually had close relationship, different from Vipassana, where you could have many different kinds of instructors, but that reaching out, I think there's a very important thing about love, about the way that people bring the awakening back. If you
Yes,
recognize that all is love, then can you talk to your neighbor who
yes,
disagrees with you? Can you accept your sibling who may not be interested in gay marriage, even though you're gay? I mean,
yeah,
there are just
yeah.
many things that get confused, it seems. Even when it comes to this awakening to this deep love, it would seem then we'd have more flexible ways of handling ourselves, not making other people be a certain way.
No,
But yeah,
exactly. I think that is one of the fruits of it. But that's not to say that it's automatic. It'll take practice.
Yes,
And
yes.
that's okay. But I want to just say it's not true that Zen's always been about the one-to-one relationship. There've been many, throughout its history, there have been, and certainly in the Tang Dynasty, there were teachers with thousands of students. There's, in the 20th century, there's that famous teacher Shu Yun, White Cloud. He had
Right.
tens of thousands of
Mm.
followers. There's a different kind of teacher-student relationship, clearly, in a situation like that. But again, I think what I'm trying to do is not say do this and not that. It's say if you have difficulty accessing, for what a million reasons it might be, accessing this kind of teaching / training, here's a way you can at least get a taste of it. And when that's not enough, please reach out to whatever else you need. It's not supposed to be a substitute. And I
Right.
remember hearing Richie Davidson, the neuroscientist,
Yes.
contemplative neuroscientist guru guy. He said, I've been resistant to tech all my life, but we need to scale this kind of teaching, and tech is how we've got to do it. And I thought, I kind of agree. I think I don't think of it as a replacement. I just think it's broadening the field of availability.
Well, I really love it that you're doing it, particularly because it is you. I mean, I see you as someone very different from Sam Harris. I don't know Sam Harris, and I don't know the guy that did Headspace, but I do know that Sam Harris doesn't really identify as a Buddhist practitioner. I mean, he doesn't seem to embrace the idea of karma or of rebirth, and so then he doesn't take on this larger framework, which I think does lead to something that is a new kind of framework in the West, at least, and the fact that you're doing it online and you're kind of sticking with the framework, I think, from what I can tell in the book. I know you're also inclusive. You're including lots of people with lots of different narratives, but you're also coming back to the tradition you're in, and I think that is really lovely. So, I mean, it's not as though I'm in any way complaining about this. It's just that I do have questions about people. I mean, what I have seen and what I have gotten concerned about is this tremendous rush to awakening on the
Mm.
part of this renaissance of psychedelics, and which I haven't also been negative about, even though I do have concerns about legalizing so many psychedelics that can cause psychotic experiences. I am concerned about that, but I see people wanting to have this experience, but then what do they do with it? You know?
Yeah, I think that's very, very reasonable. Um, I also hear a lot and read a lot about the use of psychedelics for helping with mental health, not really with awakening. But I've just been reading a very good book actually by somebody called Rose Cartwright. She's an English author, screenwriter, who wrote I think, quite a widely acclaimed book on her OCD, and then 8 years later, it's just written another one, kind of sort of what's the word, abrogating from what she said in the first one. Where she says, the whole diagnostic approach of modern medicine and psychiatry towards OCD and other mental health issues is really quite. She doesn't buy it anymore, and she's been doing psychedelic therapy, as I think she would think of it, with guys and without, and has found it, according to her, very helpful. But she's not really talking about awakening. She's talking about, trauma and treating her own mental health issues, or boosting her own mental health. She might see it that way. I think there's that side of it too. I hear more about that. Well, I hear as much about that, the trauma treatment side of psychedelics. Gosh, it's a complex issue. I mean, because I know people who do psychedelics now in a very structured way as a group, and it is very supportive, and then the environment in which they're administered is carefully thought out, and they're all reporting very good effects with it.
Yes, and that's what Mike Berger does and also reports. And I would always, my part of my response though is that In my early years in Zen training, it was a year of me studying on the ethical side of Buddhist practice before I was allowed to really enter into deeper samadhi states, at least by instruction. And so there's an ethical foundation that is in Buddhist practice that often gets sort of it doesn't get so much emphasized, maybe in the West. But to me, the practice of the precepts and also understanding the training of the mind involved in the precepts is something that I think doesn't occur in the psychedelic world, even after there's integration and work with community. There's maybe not the recognition or way of behaving with other people or with the world, that there's a way to train that so that we don't do harm after we have deep insights, because
Yes.
it's easy. What Mike and I talk about often is that when people have these psychedelic experience, they want to proselytize, and often it's easy for them to proselytize as though they know something that other people don't know. And then that gets into, again, the problem of special ideas or something. um,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. And the
So
power trips and all of that, the
yeah, yeah.
power vortices that can develop. Yeah.
So I want to come back before we finish here to original love, for you to say what you think love is in this context. And but I am going to circle back to a podcast that we just put online with Bobby Rhodes. I don't know if you know her. She's a Zen teacher in California. She's a Korean Zen teacher, and she's the Dharma heir of San, the Korean teacher. And what I want to tell you is what she told us on the podcast. So she took not LSD, she took psilocybin. She said she just decided at this point in her life, she's retired, I think she's in her 60s or 70s, she was going to take a handful of mushrooms. And she did. And so she said she was right there in her meditation room on the bed. It didn't sound as though she had any guidance. She was just with herself. And so she said the first hour or so, she had all these incredibly opening experiences and, light and colors and forms. And she was interested and aware that she'd known this territory. And then it switched to what she called the dark side. And she said it was cold and it was completely dark and there were snakes. And she, after a while, actually saw that this is the dark side, and she really wondered what was happening. And so she sat up and she said, which is part of their practice, "What is this?" Or the primary point, "What's the point?" And suddenly she was encircled with a huge hug that she said was so complete that it started to even squeeze her. She sort of said, "Well, that's enough. I got it." But what she was what she was seeing was that the dark and the light side were both encircled. That it
Oh,
was it was the hug.
that's beautiful. I mean, that's more or less what I feel as well. Like I think when hindrances come up, or when anxiety comes up, if our practice has got to a certain point, we don't have to get rid of it. We don't have to handle it. How do I deal with this? We just can let it be, and it'll show that even there in a deep fear, there's some kind of love at the bottom of it. And I think all roads lead to love. I'll tell you actually, Polly, I know people who are doing they do this psychedelic thing as a little brotherhood, as a group of men. And I decided one afternoon to go, and they invited me to join them for a day actually, and I kind of went along merely to see what was happening. But they were doing this one that is supposed to be so fearsome called 5-MeO-DMT, which
Oh, I've heard of it. Yeah, I
which is
saw. Well, I read Michael Pollan's book too. So
yeah,
yes.
exactly. And something in me just said, yeah, what the hell,
Yeah.
and I did it. I had a big dose,
Hmm.
and I just went to something that I often go to, where there just isn't anything. There just isn't anything except a formless, nameless, powerful love. And it wasn't that, it really wasn't very different from what I quite often experience day to day at times, especially when meditating. Everything falling away, And the only thing left is this love that's it's formless, it's everywhere, it's nowhere, it's hard to place it, but it's so strong and it's very beautiful, and it's got a fearsome power in it also of its own. And I just kind of, I wasn't really there. There was just this love there. And then gradually it faded, and I was back in the room with these guys who were all friendly and nice, and and it was a very nice experience. But it did again make me think, well, practice can get you here, no doubt
Yeah.
about it. And probably if it does, it's a bit more stable and lasting if it does. I don't know.
Well,
But I don't.
possibly it has that undergirding of, of a practiced ethical behavior, because eventually it's not like you're doing the ethical behavior, but you're so, I feel like I practice so much of what does it mean not to kill, for example? What does that mean? And that has so much meaning that it comes up in various ways all the time. But then also this love that permeates, it does include the darkness. And so, when people have, say, for example, a child who commits suicide, or they have a child who's murdered, or they're living in a situation where their community is destroyed by something, it's difficult under those circumstances to have the experience that this is love. And yet, I think if a person has heard, if they've even heard that it is, that experience of tremendous loss or chaos takes on a different meaning.
I totally agree with you. And I think in the end, that's really, for me, that's alongside the ethical commitments and living out of them. I think that's the deepest purpose of it all, is how, because we will all face catastrophic losses, of course, and how to live with that without losing hope, without losing all the beauty and positivity as well. What kind of condition, what kind of discovery can we make? What kind of training can we be graced with? Or what kind of growth can we be graced with, or development can we be graced with, that will allow us to be able to be with all the hardest things, and not kind of fall away from it, and still be able to be in some way helpful and in some way actually positive, in our beings. And that's my aspiration, is to find, and I don't feel I'm there yet, but to be able to be really in a kind of positive sense of peace and totally open, so that nothing's excluded, and nothing actually shakes that, an unshakable peace. I mean, I don't mean peace in a sort of bland sense of nothing bothers me, but things very much will bother me, but
Mhm.
somehow there's a peace that's unshakable at the same time.
Well, I
That's
think you're getting there. I mean, if I see you getting there, and I know I myself have always suffered most with my family members because I care about them so much. I mean, there's this tremendous irony that the very people that are on the journey with us that we care about the most can also be the people that disturb our sense of ease or love. That's
absolutely.
and that's where
Yeah.
the karmic side seems to enter in, and there has to be some mystery in that. There has to be the recognition that we don't know
Yes.
exactly what's going on, and yet it's okay. It's not our fault, or people blame
Yeah.
themselves very easily. I think that what you offer in the book, I assume you offer it also in the retreats and the app, that is this bigger framework to put the hug around the whole thing, that it isn't just what feels good, or what seems transcendent. Um,
Exactly.
it's
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. No, you put it beautifully. It's
Well,
great.
you put it that way because I was reading the book again this morning. We're using your book in my sangha right now, and so I may be reaching out to you. I hope you will agree to spend maybe a half hour with our sangha. This I will not be in the recording, but I thought I would make that a little footnote on our interview. So
Yeah. I'd love to, Polly. Yeah. Gosh, well, let's keep in touch about that.
So thank you so much, Henry. It's just always such a deep pleasure and a real privilege for me to speak with you, but also to speak about this book, because I hope that many people engage not just in reading the book, but inquiring into original love, and then reach out to you and get on your app and also join your program without me recommending it directly to them, that they can, in general, find the program Original Love with Henry Shukman. So I appreciate your presence so much. Thank you.
Well, Polly, thank you so much for having me. It's been a real deep joy. I feel very, very grateful and kind of energized and enlivened by getting to interact with you and having this time.